Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Grant. I'm a bookseller here. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When we get time to questions, please line up at the microphone by the right pillar. This event is being live streamed, so please speak into the mic so everyone can hear the question. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Ernesto Castañeda and Daniel Jenks with their new book, Reunited, Family Separation and Central American Youth Migration. In Reunited, sociologists Ernesto and Daniel explain the reasons for Central American youth's migration, describe the journey, and document how the young migrants experience separation from and subsequent reunification with their families. Offering a complex exploration of youth migration and family reunification, Reunited provides a moving account of how young Central American migrants make the journey north and ultimately reintegrate with their families in the United States. Ernesto is director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University. Daniel is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome to Ernesto and Daniel.
Hello guys, good afternoon. How are you? Thank you so much for coming. Can you hear me okay? Yes,
And
fantastic.
this one as well.
This is great. All right, I see some familiar faces and some new faces. That's fantastic. All right, Daniel, why did we write this book?
Yeah, so just to get started on that, I think kind of just to go back with the context of how people understand migration as a phenomenon, popular understandings are really kind of based on the border and the moment, right? And they don't really go beyond the border to the past or to the future, right? And so with that, we kind of were looking at the migration of Central American youth to the DC area starting around 2014 and kind of really wanted to ask why was this happening and then what happens on either side of the border, right? And looking at kind of the idea of integration. Some other things are there's a kind of a reliance on really kind of traumatic images as shock value, right? For media clicks, but also, you know, to draw attention to very real issues. But part of that is, you know, there are things that go beyond the border and the trauma at the border and the trauma on the way that are important. So you'll notice, like with the cover of our book, it's youth playing soccer, right? And so it brings the conversation to the communities here, right? And what we can do here to support youth and their families. And so around 2014, like I said, more and more migrants were coming from Central America, and this was kind of posited as a very unexpected, unprecedented thing. One of our key arguments in the book is that this actually was very predictable, right? Which goes back to a number of historical trends that we'll talk a bit more about, and as well as the fact that youth have special rights as migrants. So youth have, you know, due to being under 18, really, and perceived vulnerability, they have special rights when asking for asylum, when immigrating, things like that. But there's this idea that then when you all of a sudden you become an adult, you don't need those rights anymore. And so we wanted to kind of deconstruct some of that with youth and really look at why they're coming, how they fare in their communities, and deconstruct some of these ideas in the media about them being alone, right? Which isn't always true. They're known as unaccompanied, but that doesn't mean that all that means is that they didn't have a parent or legal guardian with them upon crossing the border. And really, we also wanted to look at and ask, why is this happening to Central American youth, but not youth from other countries, right? And there's a number of reasons why that is, largely kind of arbitrary and unequal. So with that too, I think, again, with the border in the moment, there's a lot of visibility of youth at the border, a lot of images, a lot of pictures, forcible family separations. but an invisibility kind of within communities in the US, because people stopped thinking about it at that point. So we wanted to make sure that there was visibility on both sides of the border, as well as on the border. And kind of another thing that we were thinking about is public images in 2016, 2017 of the Trump administration's forcible family separations. These were legitimately terrible things, and they did receive a lot of publicity. But one of the core arguments that we make is that families being separated through basically labor, economics, and poverty isn't all that different from being forcibly separated at the border. It's kind of a slow separation as opposed to a fast separation, you know, due to illegalization and things of the like, which again, it's a different dynamic for Central Americans than it is for Australians or French people, right? And so that's kind of really important things to consider. And it leads us to ask why we let these separations happen and how we can stop them and how we can, again, support these youth and families once they're in our communities, in our schools, right? You know, because they're our neighbors, right? And kind of lastly, for why we wrote the book, looking at it through the lens of integration. So how can we look at belonging for immigrants, and how is this unique for youth as opposed to adults, and how they can integrate into our communities, and the ways that the DC area really can be a model for other cities, other regions as their migrant populations grow and change in the future, kind of looking at social programs, school programs and funding, healthcare, right, labor protections, social work and supports, things like that. So
thank you, Daniel.
Over to Ernesto.
Thank you. So yes, as Daniel said, the main reason for writing this book when we did, we started the research in 2016. A number of people at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University, a lot of students there help us do the interviews, do the analysis, write it up. And Daniel and I were the authors that kind of gave birth to the final product, but it's really a collective product over many years. And why we wrote it in 2014, indeed, as Daniel was saying, there was this extensive news coverage of the unaccompanied minors. You probably remember. And it happened again at the beginning of the Biden administration, although I think a lot of people have forgotten about the last one. So indeed, as Daniel said, people were surprised. What we're going to do in the book is that we knew it was going to happen. Why? And it's connected to the argument we tried to make about family separations. So what we know is, if some in the audience, a lot of people in Washington, D.C., right? If you are a diplomat, a scientist at the NIH, a chemist, a PhD, a professor like me and others, you can come and you are from another part of the world. You can bring your families with a family visa and you can come legally, right? We have Fulbright scholars, and that's good. This back and forth, it's a positive that brings a lot of ideas, innovation, creation, and advance in science. And American companies need that foreign talent. So there are legal avenues for the highly talented people. Maybe we need a little bit more, but there are avenues. But if you're a nanny, if you are taking care of the elderly, if you're a paralegal, if you're a nurse but you don't have all the certifications to be validated in the US, if you want to work in a retirement home, etc., a lot of work that we need. You have to come without papers, or you can come with a worker visa as an able-bodied adult. So you can come as a male. Traditionally, this was from Mexico, as a female from the Philippines, from the Caribbean, from Africa. But it will be really, really hard that as an agricultural worker, you can come legally and bring your family. That's not the way we design the system. And the US is not the only one doing this. Europe, Canada, many governments have these. We want workers as individuals, and we forget that we come in families, right? So that's the main issue. So the family separation was horrible, the way that Trump did it, and there was a right outcry. But we have been separating families through our legal immigration system for decades. So that's the argument that we're trying to make in the book. And again, that's an ongoing situation. So if and I'll explain why, but if your family left El Salvador, let's say, We're talking about 2014, so let's say 12 or 14 years later. So if your mother left El Salvador in 2000, and then your father maybe left a couple of years later, and it's 2014, and you have low access to higher education that is accessible in El Salvador, low employment for college graduates. If you are from a region that the gangs have controlled, and they're asking you they're recruiting you because you are 14 and they think you can start enforcing and using guns to tax local businesses for the organized crime. And you have your family members here who you miss. You want to live with your biological mother, your biological father. And these pressures from El Salvador, you have all the incentive to leave, right? So you're coming of age, you are 14, your grandmother has been taking care of you for a long time. She's getting really, really sick. Maybe she passed recently. So there's no reason for you to stay in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. You are going to come to the US. It's not a surprise. It's a cycle, right? It's a cohort effect. Now, why are people leaving El Salvador? And that's in one of the chapters is historical, and I'm going to touch briefly. We have all the details in the book, and there's other books in this library that you can buy to learn that important connection between the U.S. and Central American politics. But suffice it to say here that in the 80s, there were a lot of civil wars where the U.S. was supporting certain regimes as part of the Cold War paranoia. We were afraid of Guatemala. They elected a guy that is a little bit social democratic. He may be a little bit too lefty for our flavor. No, let's support a coup from the right wing elements. So a lot of activists, a lot of peasants, a lot of people, a lot of indigenous people had to escape Guatemala to save their lives. Many of them went to Mexico, settled there, became Mexican citizens. But others, thanks to churches, activists, diplomats based in DC, came to this region in the first sanctuary movement, looking for refuge here in San Francisco, in LA, etc. So that's how the connection with the Central American communities got established. And we had then organizations like Carecen and others, Clínica del Pueblo, doing fantastic work in our region. So then once you have family established in here, then little by little, the children come, the parents, the siblings, because we have a lot of jobs that we need to fill. And you can go back to the pandemic and right after, and there were a lot of signs of help wanted. Who has been satisfying this labor? In the US, for a long time, that was Mexicans, but the Mexican demographics have changed. So then Central Americans came and fulfilled that labor demand for a while. So you have these things happening in El Salvador, the family separations, families trying to reunite in the US, and then a lot of jobs that needed to be filled. So Central Americans also are filling the job. That's why we have a lot of Guatemalans who come. They may not speak Spanish. The first language may be an indigenous language. So they're going directly to work. And the New York Times had this article a couple of, maybe last year, that also is, how we didn't know about this, how surprising that we have minors from Central America working in US industries. Daniel and I were not surprised because we had seen this. It was very hard for us to talk to indigenous Guatemalans in the area because they are already in the workforce. Most of the people we're able to talk to is the people that, thanks to mentors, thanks to teachers, probably people in the audience, they were able to stay in high school, to graduate, and some of them are going to college now. So it's a story of success that we told. That's why we have the cover of the soccer field. This happens to be the team of my son standing back there, who I coach, but it's full of Central American kids who are not different from the other kids in the high schools locally who like to play soccer. So a little bit of that. And again, the US is connected to this because of the support of right-wing regimes in the 80s, because of the deportation of gang members from US prisons where the gangs like Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13 was formed. And then we exported that. It's a US creation from the racial dynamics between the different ethnic groups and the police in Los Angeles that then was sent to a place where the police was very weak, like El Salvador. And then again, this labor demand and this lack of visas for family members. Then we should talk about a family propel migration in a simple way. I guess just briefly. So we advanced this term that we came up together, Daniel and I, that it's talking about a process that is not new in the sociology of migration research literature, but I think it explains a lot. People migrate for escaping violence, escaping persecution, for labor opportunities, for educational opportunities, but as you might imagine, for family reasons, right? Again, if your mother is living in another country, you may want to live with your mother. If your husband moves, you want to follow your husband. It's something very basic that it makes a lot of sense once we say it, but it's something that many, not everybody, but many journalists have missed that obvious aspect, and many policymakers, again, they are a lot of the immigration law is at the individual level, forgetting that this happens at the family, at the network level. So that's why we also spend a lot of time in the book. And then I'll talk briefly about mental health, and I'll pass it back to Daniel to finish, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, because that's what we want to spend most of the time today answering your questions. So part of the comments, not part of the comments, part of the, I think, the contributions of the book is in particular a chapter also co-authored with other people. Leslie Bock and I have been writing for a long time about the mental health effects of having your mother, your father, living in another country and leaving you behind. They're doing it for economic reasons, as Daniel was saying. You may be having a tough economic spot in Mexico and the Philippines. Again, this happens all over the world. And you are not allowed to bring them, or it's too expensive to bring them and have them raise them in the DMV, for example. So you leave them behind with family members, and you send money, remittances every month, and that's a show of love, that you care about your family, taking care of them. You're still the breadwinner if you're a father. You're still the mother, and you may try to do teleparenting, we call it, trying to give advice and love and instructions through the phone or through the telephone. It's really tough. But then we know that the parents do it as a sacrifice, and they do it because they love and want to see their family improve. But from the point of view of a young kid, of a minor, once they become conscious that their biological mother is in the DC area, they cannot help but feel like they've been abandoned by their mother, by their father. So there's this kind of resentment, and the money is not enough to satisfy that. So again, we're not blaming the mothers. Are good mothers. They don't do it out of joy. They're not looking for adventure. They keep these connections, and they send money, and they would visit if they had the papers. They stay in touch, but it's something that is very painful for the kid, and they are dreaming of, oh, when am I going to live again with my mom? And then we also, I think what is new in this book is that we talk about when they come to in this case, the DMV area, and they are again living with their mother, with their father. They are what Leslie Bock, Jenks, and I, we call families of strangers. That they, okay, yes, he's my father or my half brother, but I haven't lived with him for 14, 16 years. I don't know him. I don't know how he likes the coffee. I don't know what time he wakes up. I don't know what are his favorite movies, because we have never had that quotidianity of the everyday life together. So you are coming and you are reunited. Everything is good. You have papers. You're happy, but you have to establish a new relationship. And because we're talking about people coming here 14, 15, 16, 18, these are tough years. As teenage years, you are creating you're creating your differentiation from your parents. You're becoming your own adult. It's a hard time to make a new relationship with a parent that you felt left you. Not because of divorce, not because of lack of love, but because of these international economic relationships. So it's a strange dynamic. It's hard, but again, we're happy to report that there's great programs happening in schools in the region that mend these ties, forge these bonds, and then they create new healthy families. But it's not something automatic. It's not enough just to be in the same household. You have to work at the relationship making, understanding why your mom left, understanding different worldviews, and having group therapy between the mothers or the parents or the children left behind, and seeing that it's not a fault of their own family, but it's something that a lot of people in the community are experiencing, is really, really good to kind of overcome it and then create a new family that is strong, that is going to contribute to our economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that on that note as well, I think one of the core reasons that our book, I think, is as good as it is, right, is that we were able to talk to parents and caregivers and youth rather than just one group, right? And so you can kind of see like what the whole family's perspective was, you know, a year after reunification, and how that's different for a 12-year-old versus how it's different for a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old or 8-year-old, right? And also how it's different in Prince George's County versus Montgomery County versus Fairfax County, and how state policies and different school districts face different challenges and solve different challenges, I think is really important. And I think that through all of this, kind of on the macro scale, right, it shows kind of some of the ways that there are really deep and arbitrary inequalities for rights for migrants, right, with what country you're from, how old you are, and with some things, for instance, with Salvadorans, if you have special rights as a youth, and so you can come to the U.S. from a third country that shares a land border. You can come to the southern border and ask for asylum. You cannot get on a plane, come to the U.S. and do that. It costs $5,000 to $15,000 to get from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras to the U.S. And it's, I was looking on Google Flights earlier this week, and it's about $70 for a Spirit Airlines one-way ticket from San Salvador to D.C. And so then that financial level of burden, right, then sits on those families that are often working for lower than minimum wage in having, to do all of these things, right, try to support entire families. And so, and that's like a really, really in-depth inequality. And then the fact too, that a lot of the young people who we profile in the book were only able to come here because they actually were able to have family who lived here and maybe had somebody who could front the money, right? And so it's definitely not a one-sided kind of thing. Now, Central American migration recently has been declining for a few geopolitical reasons recently. Mainly Salvadoran migration has been declining, especially for youth, but similar levels for Hondurans and Guatemalans. But it will likely rebound. It will be back in the news. But the larger point, though, is that some of these dynamics aren't unique to Central Americans. They're illustrative of larger societal forces, right? So when you look at Venezuelan migration today, families inevitably are being split up the same way. A lot of them are coming as family units, but inevitably there's my mom is 80 years old, for instance, and I can leave my kids with my mom and come to the US, work, send remittances, make sure that my kids are able to buy food, right? That's largely the story that we tell, and I think largely happening today with Venezuelans. Whereas, again, with the media, what we're seeing is kind of the politics of it, the circus of it, right? And kind of all as a result of poor funding priorities on the side of the federal government and on cities, and really the Republicans' ability to profit and gain power from xenophobia and racism, right? And so instead of kind of looking at all of that, we really want to ask, how do we welcome and integrate and support these kids, support these families, right? And you could ask similar questions, right? How Venezuelans are treated differently than, for instance, Ukrainians who've come to the U.S. after the outbreak of that war over there, right? Qualitatively, there's a war in the Ukraine right now, not a war in Venezuela. But if the end result is you're coming to the U.S., is it really that different, right? But Ukrainians are not in any way, shape, or form talked about the same way that Venezuelans are talked about in popular discourse. So really kind of trying to pin down the idea that immigration and immigrants are not a threat, right? There's not a crisis in the way that it's properly understood. I'd also say that gang violence and civil war can explain leaving, but it doesn't explain arrival in the U.S., right? That can come through a whole level of other things in the macro ways which we see and understand migration, right? For a long time, migration of adults was completely understood in these kind of one-way push-pull factors, right? It's just economics, it's just the labor market, or it's just family. And in reality, it's far more complicated than either of those things. And furthermore, for youth, none of those dynamics really play out in the same way. And the discussion really becomes, okay, what is the reality for these youth, and how, what are their interactions like? And it's unique for youth because they actually go to school, right? And for adult migrants, a lot of times it's you come here and you have to start working immediately. But youth are in schools, and they have that access, that kind of day-to-day interaction really with the government, because it's public schools that they're going to, and in the community at large, right? I mean, I don't know, I'm sure some of us remember being in middle school or in high school, right? And you interact with all sorts of different people, and that can really kind of change the integration and acculturation process, but it still relies on a lot of different variables that we deconstruct in the book and in our chapter on education. So let's see what else.
Start thinking about your questions. We're gonna wrap up.
Anything else on politics that you want to discuss? I know you've been on TV a lot recently talking about that.
A lot, but I'm gonna let the questions drive those discussions and see what people have in mind here. But thank you, Daniel. It was a pleasure working with Daniel.
Likewise.
They were fantastic. So yeah, it's a collective book, and again, it only makes sense for an audience that wants to learn a little bit more about the context of people they may know already in their personal lives, but how they fit into these larger stories. So the book is published by an academic foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, which was fantastic supporting the publication of the book, but it's written really for a general audience that I think it's probably easier, more straightforward, more fact-based than the New York Times, the New Yorker magazine, straight fact-check language. So we really encourage you to take a look. All right, who wants to get started with the first question?
I think there's a microphone right up here.
Okay, sir, please.
So if you want to.
You know, migration has been a problem in the United States forever. So is there any thread that you see for the past so many years?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so the gentleman here, I'm going to repeat I think this has been webcast live and recorded on the website, so let me rephrase the question in case it wasn't heard. I'm not sure. But the question is, migration is a phenomenon that's been happening for a long time in the United States. What is new? What is different, right? So yes, that's a great question. That's why we invite you to not believe the hype of journalists, which they cover day by day, as that's their job. But this is not really a crisis because we have been there before. So in terms of absolute numbers, what is the percentage of the US? What is the percentage of the U.S. population today that is foreign-born? Anybody knows? 14%? That is correct. That is exactly right. That's the official and the best estimate, 14%. We've been there before. Exactly 100 years ago, we had a little bit more than that. Early 1900s, we had that. Yes, with World War II and the Great Depression, we saw a decrease. The baby boom generation, that was a time when the baby boom itself drove population growth, drove economic growth and innovation. So that was a time where actually there was less need of migration, and the borders were more closed than today. So for a lot of people of that generation, which is huge and very important, very influential, and that's the generation of Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Trump, a little bit, Biden is a little bit past that, but it's part of that boom. That generation grew up in a time when there were indeed less percentage of the foreign-born. So, but except for that historical time, we've been always around 12 to 16% foreign-born. It's been a constant. And if you look at countries in Europe, they're a little higher than that too. So all the rich countries in the world, they have more than 14%. So something that I tell friends in Latin America is that they want to grow and become rich, they should bring their percentage of foreign-born to around 14%, because in many countries, like Mexico, is like 2%. It's really low. So a way to grow would be to have more immigrants. So the numbers are not actually, the perception is that it's a crisis, but again, also in the past, journalists, people complain that there were too many immigrants. That's not new. That's very, very traditionally American. I think an important difference to keep, and just briefly, I'm writing about this in another piece, but maybe what has changed is that indeed in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, there were a lot of Mexicans and some Central Americans coming to the US through the desert trying to pass undetected, and they were actually doing that, and so the numbers were not really good. So all these graphs that you see, the graph that Trump turned to look and show the increases in number of people crossing the border, they are inaccurate because the methodology of how we count, how many times we see somebody, often the same person, has changed throughout time. And the main difference, while many Mexicans, not all, but a portion of Mexicans were trying to pass undetected outside of ports of entry, what is new about the unaccompanied minors that we're talking about Venezuelans, about the recent arrivals, is that they're coming and they're saying, hey, hello, I'm here. I want to claim for asylum. Can you help me, please? I don't have a family member to stay with. I need a little help with housing, with food. So they are more looking like refugees, but there's not a budget item for them. That's where there's the tension. And they're easier to photograph, to film in the border. They're making a line to try to come in, while the other people were trying to pass undetected at night. But the numbers, I don't think they are that different because, again, they're fulfilling jobs that are open in the economy. And they're proportionally the same, but they are more visible than ever. But again, I don't think we've seen, and we had crisis even more recently. We had the Afghans. Remember, there were a lot of Afghans in the DMV. They were in hotels, and they were, oh, but how can Washington afford to pay rooms for them they're in Arlington in this motel? How can we afford it? And now we forgot about it. All of them, we know them. We have our friends, we know them. They have jobs, they teach, they are professionals. They have found a way, they pay their own rent, they pay their own food, and they're part of our communities and our economy. They play soccer. So again, in the Central American youth of 2014, they have integrated. And the Venezuelans today, yeah, they're new, they're finding their way. But in 10 years, they will be part of our communities, or they go back, or some of them will indeed get deported, etc. That's another story in our book. We couldn't follow completely with everybody to keep their privacy, but word should that, unfortunately, these are people without criminal records. They were doing their homework, going to school, etc. But unfortunately, some of the people we interviewed for the book are probably no longer here. They've been sent back to their countries of origin. That's something that our law does a lot too. So again, more similarities than differences, but perception has changed, and obviously perception is important. Do you want to say anything?
Hi there. I'm excited to hear that there's a chapter that focuses on education because I am an ESOL teacher here in the public schools in Washington, D.C. And I'm curious to hear from your experiences interviewing, and I'm curious if you interviewed any school personnel as well. I'd love to hear about that angle. As you were talking about sort of the integration, we find that most of our multilingual learners are U.S. born. You know, we have a subset of our population who are newcomers who have come with their families recently, but they're relatively small compared to the U.S. born population of multilingual learners. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that data and those interviews.
Yes, thank you for the question, Daniel. Go ahead.
Sure. And can I ask where you're a teacher? Which county?
In D.C.
In DC. Okay. So we talked to, so like I said, most of our interviews were in PG County, Montgomery County, Fairfax County, because that's where the largest populations of Central Americans are. And so it was interesting because we heard a lot about different ways that different jurisdictions are working on that, right? And so some talked about how in DC they were seeing really big demographic shifts, which really requires a big adjustment, right? Because if you have a school that goes from 40% white, 60% black to 75% Latinx, Hispanic, and large majority immigrant in that, there's a big culture shift that is required. So they talked about training programs for teachers, but also really the need to hire people, hire social workers, hire teachers that speak both languages, right, and know how to work with those populations. And there were a lot of really interesting programs that they set up. Like there was one that we profile in the book called Learning Together, where they, after school, are able to work with youth and their parents kind of together. It's a school-based program, but it is social work, right, on, how do you understand your family, right? How do you understand this family of strangers? So that's one of the big things that we talk about in there. And even PG County, for instance, at the time also was, I believe, building schools specifically for newcomers, and where they kind of do a 2-year program where it's let's get you base level in English. Let's talk about what it means to be an immigrant, and let's talk about your next step and how we get you to that next step. Because a lot of the youth we talked to had different desires. Some wanted to be lawyers, right? Some wanted to one was talking about how he was working on his technician certificate in El Salvador, but then was kind of last minute, okay, we can get you up north now, let's go. So that was interrupted. So he wanted to kind of be able to go work on technical things. So they're doing some really cool programming in PG and in Fairfax County, especially on that. Ernesto, what else do you have?
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. And just real quick, yes, we indeed interviewed half a dozen principals, social workers, people with special programming. a few teachers. But yeah, the work you do is important and it's hard, we know. One of a lot to say, so there's a lot in the book, but a couple of things. Unfortunately, the youth, because most of the book, probably half of the words in the book are coming from the youth themselves. Like we let them speak for themselves and we use their words translated into English, but otherwise it's their language. And for example, something that they complain about is that they face discrimination and they struggle with English. They want to learn English and it's hard. That's no doubt. That's a big goal, learning English. But they also are made to feel inadequate about their Spanish because they're standard to what the teacher in some classes is asking. And then unfortunately, there's a tension between the U.S.-born kids and the immigrant kids or kids from different areas, and then kind of also internalizing this jockey status. Oh, but you're illegal and I'm legal, or oh, I was born here, you're not. And unfortunately, the youth internalizing these and being very cruel with each other. So that's something that really hurt the new coming immigrants, and they use terms and particular words. So there was a quote from one girl that said, "I sound stupid in English, but I'm smart in Spanish." And that really kind of breaks your heart. And so it's like they feel they cannot communicate and show how all the potential they have because they're struggling with the language, right? So that was something that was very important. And what I think one of the takeaways, I think, from the program is because of these differentiations, style plays and power plays, immersion type programs where there's U.S. white citizens and immigrant citizens and people that are in their homes in the U.S., they have grown with Spanish or other languages, that they're all learning together and making mistakes in Spanish, in English, in French, in Chinese, whatever, that creates this solidarity and that you validate that there are different languages and cultures and they're different. They're not better than worse. That is very good for the mental health of immigrant kids. And then it also provides a lot of skills for other people to learn the language. So I think that the DSL classes are not only for the newcomers because then they may feel ostracized. And again, I know that's not the goal or the purpose of the teachers, but in socializing the school, sometimes they feel that they are seen as the stupid kids by other colleagues when that is not the purpose of the school. And then many of them wanna graduate and move to the other classes, but then they don't want to speak in English, in Spanish again. So it's a tricky thing, and yeah, we did talk about that. Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Julia, and I'm a Brazilian psychologist and social psychologist, community psychologist, and I've been here for more than 30 years now. And I was director of the Violence Prevention of the American Psychological Association. So what I see many different things here. First, the American economy and country is very competitive, not just with people who are from other countries, within themselves, within ourselves. I work for a very American association for 25 years. So the competition is huge. If you are better than I am, if you have more titles than I am, so I have a PhD or you don't have a PhD, if you are a psychologist with no PhD, forget it, okay? So it's not because it's Latino or French or la. No, the American society is very competitive. And then we see all those people from Latin America who do not have degrees, who do not have experience, and they want to take our jobs here. So it is made for a very difficult situation. So thanks God, we have psychologists, we have educators, and we have many, churches and other institutions that are helping this population to understand what is the America. America is not the beautiful, wonderful thing. It's a very competitive place for you to make your life here. So you need to be prepared for that. And that's what in the countries, they don't tell about those things. They don't say that, what is competition? Because in many of our countries, I'm from Brazil. Brazil is much tougher than, Nicaragua or any other countries. And I'm from São Paulo, the New York, Brazilian New York. So since you are, like baby, you learn how to compete, in the playground, in the school, for jobs. So we are educated that way. Many people in Latin America, they are not, especially those coming from very rural, no education levels or very simple jobs for them there. And they come here not prepared for all of that.
Right.
So I just want to call attention, for what is this terrible thing from people coming from rural Latin America, coming to like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Texas, etc. I mean, it's a huge learning.
Right.
It's a huge learning. So please think about those things. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the comment. Real quick, we indeed, now Dana and I are working on interviewing Afghans who have come here and Ukrainians. And that's one of the big issues of immigrants, that they may have a PhD or be psychologists in the countries, lawyers, nurses, and then doctors, many doctors. And then they come to the US and their credentials are not recognized because they didn't study here. And that process is not easy. So they may be driving, nothing wrong, but they may be driving an Uber, working in Walmart, etc. Because they cannot practice what they did. And they are, some of them say, well, that's the cost of coming here. I have to keep my head down. I have to be humble. And this is for my kids so they can go to college and they can compete with everybody. So that's an issue, that the credentials, they cannot really compete because the credentials are not easily recognized. And there's processes, but it's hard. Then there's the misconception, I don't think that's what you were saying, but let's talk about it briefly, that immigrants are coming here and are taking our jobs or taking, and again, you can think of a particular anecdote or a case when that happened. But overall, what happens, right? If you have, like Politics and Prose, right? I think it started with one store in DuPont, and now there's so many, right? So the more that the DMV grows, the more there's college-educated people, or probably many of you have more than a college degree, there's more demand for books, right? So the more people, the more educated people, the more people competing, the more demand for bookstores, the more Politics and Prose can open new branches. So it's the same thing with immigrants. They come, they're fighting for jobs, but immigrants start businesses at a higher rate than the US born. They hire more people than the US born. They bring a lot of innovation. Half of the top companies are co-founded by immigrants. So what I'm saying is that immigrants also then end up hiring a lot of locals. So they grow the pie. So it's not necessarily a competition. Last thing, and I'll get to Daniel, and then we'll get to the next question. Because of a lot of the Central American people coming from rural areas, indeed, they are coming and they're working, cleaning our houses, taking care of our babies, walking our dogs. So women can go and become professionals and compete and be part of because now it's not enough to have one person in the working, right? You need the two spouses, if people are lucky, to be in the professional labor force, to have a middle income with a few children. So, and there's not enough time to do basic skills. So we rely on cheap labor to deliver our food, to bring stuff to us, to buy our groceries, to deliver food, so we can save more time for our professional jobs. So there's a subsidy in a way that these rural, uneducated, unskilled people, in this case from Central America, in a way allow for our middle class style of living.
Yeah, I would also say, and thank you for your comment. I just want to point out a few things kind of about the scope of our work, about the book, and some of the other work that we're doing. But as far as this book goes, we're really talking about largely 10 to 17-year-olds who are fleeing gang violence. Were fleeing gang violence. And so, yeah, they might be in the rural areas, they go to school. And then a lot of them were no longer able to go to school at all because they were being basically, you have to walk a few miles to school, and the gang is in between point A and point B, and they're saying, hey, you're 14, you need to join us, you need to take this gun, you need to do this, you need to kill people, right? They were not leaving for like, oh, this is going to be so fun. Their parents didn't leave because they were like, oh, this is going to be great, right? It's a decision that's made in it's an individual decision that's made in a much larger structural nexus, right? Where we really have to consider what the U.S. government has done, and how that creates a world, right? That this happens, right? It was not oh, I'm going to just come to the U.S. and run around, right? It's I don't want to get killed by the gang. And another thing that I'd add as well on the economics note is I think you had recently published a blog article with some financial information about how, for instance, like mass deportations could probably take us into a recession, right? Like Trump is proposing, right? That would be a very serious problem. But a conversation that we have a lot is okay, there's all this data points about how good actually immigrants are very good for the economy and they help the economy grow. And what I find myself often asking is, do they need to be good for the economy for us to really have a moral reasoning to say, okay, we need to protect these 12-year-olds, right? You know, we have, even if it's not within the U.S. political project, it's within international law, right? So.
Real quick, I have another book
And then
that
we'll
I
get
see
to
a
yours.
couple of people, Immigration Realities, they're going to be also sold in Politics and Prose. And there we say kind of what Daniel was saying, that migration is a win-win because it's the morally right thing to do, despite what we hear. It's a practical thing to do. And it's also in our self-interest in an aging society like the U.S. to let immigrants is good for us. Schools keep open, teachers can have their jobs. So otherwise, the youth population is decreasing. So, but yeah, please, hi.
Hi, thank you guys so much for being here and for your great work. I really appreciate how you guys are framing things differently. And I had a question about the different statuses, and I'm wondering if you guys tracked statuses among families and if you noticed any integration or mental health outcomes based on the different statuses for the kids.
Yeah, I'm thinking of two very specific ones off the bat. One of them was able to organize documentation and fly to the US, and she was like, yeah, my migration journey was nice. It was fine. I was able to get off the plane and go be with my parents. And then there was another one that was talking about how she, you know, they went on like 4 or 5 different buses through Guatemala, and then near the border, a gang stopped them and they had to sleep in a field for 3 days while the people driving the bus were trying to like negotiate basically payment to the gangs who were threatening originally while they were on the bus to say, oh, we're gonna torch the bus on fire while you're here. And this is something that a 12-year-old is experiencing, right? And then when you look at, we were looking at the data on our mental health scales, it was interesting because a lot of them were saying, no, I don't have any mental health problems. But then when you look at the data in the PTSD screener, it's like there's possibly high odds of PTSD here, right? We can't diagnose anything. We don't do that. We weren't in the business of it. But yeah, that was the first thing that came to my mind of some very specific ones. Yeah.
So another thing about the data of the book, we do interviews, we do observations. We do it's a PTSD screener and a depression screener, and we just report on the results. We also interview the teachers, and we ask about documented status. So we know, so we said, oh, we have the quote from the youth, and then we tell you where they're from, their age, their age of migration, and when relevant, their immigration status. And it matters, obviously, as you can imagine. But I think another takeaway from the book is that the bulk of the experiences is the same. Obviously, the worth, the person, the reasons they are living, whether they have papers or not, it's 99% the same. So again, pushing against this idea. And the unaccompanied minor is a state-created category that is, as Daniel was saying, if you cross the border and there's nobody that is an adult that you are directly related to, and it's not that they are being smuggled, it's a guide, it's a coyote, but somebody that used to be trusted by the family, by word of mouth, or you may be traveling with your cousin that is an adult, or with your second-degree uncle, or a trusted neighbor. So it's not like the kids are sent to it happens, but most of the time, they're traveling in groups, they're traveling with other siblings, they're not alone in the social sense, but the government treats it because they don't enter with a parent. And also, once they come into the DMV or the US, some of them go to foster system and they are truly unaccompanied, which again, we saw with the Irish, we saw in the 1800s, a lot of youth were coming from Europe truly alone to come and work and find a living, and they are our ancestors. But the majority of the unaccompanied youth coming to the DMV, they are here now because their mother, their father, or a family member was already living here. So they are unaccompanied procedurally, legally at the border and for a few months, and then they are reunited with their biological legal families. So yeah, it matters, but also, and we can do better, and legalizing helps mental health. That's another thing that we found, that just by the fact, and again, we're not saying that all of Central America is messed up or dangerous or hellish, but some areas controlled by the gang were particularly bad. It's getting better, and then some people are going back. But what we find in this, because we asked them about mental health before and after migration, and for many of them, just the fact of migrating, it's not that everything is perfect here. There's many issues, very expensive, blah, blah, blah. Always been, and it's not how immigrants imagine it. But they feel safer. They feel much more protected from gangs. So that itself, it's a huge release of stress. And in the mental health, just by that fact of crossing a border, it improves a lot. So again, that's, I think, an innovative approach. But thank you for your question. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Sir.
I think you just sort of answered the first part of my question, which was kind of what fraction come alone. You say almost all, it sounds like the vast majority are grouped together by somebody who organizes it, presumably in Central America, receiving money to fund this from parents or interested people here in the U.S., and then they hire a bus and they come up that way. The second part of the question was about what fraction are sent back because they can't show that they need protection here, that they don't qualify for asylum.
Great questions. Thank you. In the case of minors and adults, most of them come as part of, they hire a specialist. The more we block legal migration, the more people can make a business out of it, or the more organized crime can be tempted to make money out of the traveling, the transportation more than smuggling in the best cases. For youth, it's particularly advantageous if they are not from Canada or Mexico, because if they are Mexican youth, 99% of them, they are sent back to Mexico immediately. They don't even keep a record. So Mexican kids don't have this protection. But from Guatemala down, if a minor arrives, U.S. and international law says that they have to protect them and treat them especially. That's why we have our special systems in place, and that's where the unaccompanied minor comes in. But I think your question, sir, is about adults that are coming from El Salvador or other countries asking for asylum. And indeed, there's a screening first. You have to show fear of persecution, credible fear is called, that you say, the state is behind me, or I'm a journalist or a politician, and they're persecuting me, the state for political reasons, or for my ethnic background, my racial background, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it has to pass a screening, go to a court. It depends a lot what judge sees the case in the immigration courts. But what we can say is with the Biden administration, millions of people have been deported every year. So a lot of people are out in from Haiti, from the countries we go in. Many of them, after they go through the whole process, are like, no, you cannot prove that you deserve asylum. So we're going to put you in an airplane back. And we've been sending back people to China. Even Venezuela for a while wasn't taking Venezuelans. They were taking some. Cuba took some people back. Right. And we know that in many of those cases, they're going to go directly into prison because they were criticizing the government.
No, I did want to focus on those under 18.
Oh, okay.
And you say international law.
It doesn't allow them to be sent back as minors.
So they don't have to establish a need for asylum. They just have to show up and...
Yes. That's what they are not hiding. They are...
Do they need contacts within the U.S.? Do they need either family members or someone who...
If they don't want to be on the custody of the state until they turn 18, they need those contacts. And most of them have them. They have them in their clothes, sewn in. They have in a special pocket the phone number of the family member, or somebody with papers that can claim legal custody of them. Right. So that's why we don't talk about parents, we talk about sponsors, legal sponsors, that the government recognizes are responsible for them. Right. A couple of examples of people exploiting them for labor reasons, but most of the time it's family members that have papers that everybody feels comfortable that they have custody until they turn adults. It doesn't always work. So a small portion of these kids, they struggle in school, they struggle with their family members or sponsors, and they end up in the streets homeless. And some of them may choose to go back when they turn 18. But for the most part, I think it's successful. What would you say, Daniel?
Well, I know we're just about at time, but we'll of course be around for a while to answer any more questions that exist, come up to the table. But what I'd say on that quickly is it's easier to study presence than it is to study absence, right? So the people that we were able to talk to in our book were people that we kind of characterize as somewhat lucky in that they were able to make it all the way here. They had the connections here. They were able to make it through the system. As far as population level estimates, I think, unfortunately, we don't exactly have that. We have some colleagues in different parts of the country who have been working on FOIA-ing data from Customs and Border Protection and the Office of Refugee Resettlement on at what proportion youth are put through different procedures and deported. And one of their main findings was that the largest proportion of youth that were later deported were actually from the continent of Africa. For a number of reasons. There's a much smaller number of them because we don't share any sort of land border. But yeah, that's definitely an important question, and thank you for it.
And just real quick on that, it's not so much that the U.S. will deport them because it's hard legally, but many of them don't make it. They lose a limb in the train if they have the resources and they have to get on this freight train. They may die on the attempt. Right. Adults do too. But also the reality in the last few years is that Mexico is deporting more people. Mexico deports more Central Americans back to Central America than the U.S. does, over 500,000 people every year. And although in theory they should take care of the minors, they also deport a lot of minors back to their countries or back to Guatemala or now to southern Mexico. So it's also Mexico has been acting as the buffer and as de facto police to control. So that's why we have very, very few people coming to the border today, even minors, because Mexican army, police, organized crime are making sure that they stay behind. So it is a complex. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you for being here today.